the Jewish Community Relations Council here in St. Louis, the Bernardine Center at Catholic Theological Union in Chicago, and the John C. Danforth Center on Religion and Politics. Today's conversation is also supplemented by the documentary film Holy Silence, released in January 2020. It's a film that chronicles the Vatican's reaction to the rise of Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany, and how Pope Pius XII in particular responded to the horrors of the Holocaust. And it also includes the very interesting contrast between Pope Pius XI and his successor on this question. If you registered for tonight's event, you should have received an email with the link for a free viewing of that film, and we know that many of you have watched it. It's also fine if you haven't yet watched it. You can still understand the conversation tonight, but trust me that you'll want to do so after this discussion between Professor David Kurtzer, who is featured prominently as an expert in the film, and Father John Polakowski. So let me introduce both of our discussants now, along with our moderator, Maharat Rory Picker-Nice. Pulitzer Prize-winning author David Kurtzer is the Paul Dupuy University Professor of Social Science at Brown University. His most recent book, The Pope Who Would Be King, tells the dramatic story of the Roman Revolution of 1848, when the Pope was driven into exile and the end of the papal theocracy was proclaimed. Kurtzer's previous book, The Pope and Mussolini, The Secret History of Pius XI and the Rise of Fascism in Europe, won the Pulitzer Prize for Biography in 2015 and the American Historical Association Prize for Best Book in Italian History. Kurtzer's previous books include Amalia's Tale, Prisoner of the Vatican, and The Popes Against the Jews. Kurtzer's The Kidnapping of Edgardo Mortara was a finalist for the National Book Award in 1997. Kurtzer is an authority on Italian politics, society and history, political symbolism, and anthropological demography. He is co-founder and served for many years as co-editor of the Journal of Modern Italian Studies. In 2005, Kurtzer was elected a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and from 2006 to 2011, he was the provost of Brown. John Polakowski is a member of the Order of Friar Servants of Mary, or Servites, and was ordained at the University of St. Mary of the Lake. One of the founding faculty members of the Catholic Theological Union in Chicago, he served on the faculty from 1968 until his retirement in 2017. He is the author of 10 books, including The Challenge of the Holocaust for Christian Theology, Christ in the Light of the Christian-Jewish Dialogue, and Jesus and the Theology of Israel. He is former director of the Catholic Jewish Studies Program, a part of the Bernardine Center for Theology and Ministry at CTU. Father Polakowski has been an active participant in the Christian-Jewish dialogue, as well as the wider interreligious dialogue for nearly 50 years. He served for 6 years as president of the International Council of Christians and Jews, and has served several terms on the board of the Parliament of the World's Religions. He was deeply involved in the development of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, and was appointed to the Memorial Council in 1980 by then President Jimmy Carter. And he was subsequently reappointed by Presidents George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton. Tonight's moderator is Maharat Rory Picker-Nice, who is the executive director of the Jewish Community Relations Council of St. Louis. Prior to that, she was the director of programming, education, and community engagement at Bays Abraham Congregation in University City. She is one of the first graduates of the pioneering institution training Orthodox Jewish women to be spiritual leaders and halakhic authorities. She previously served as acting executive director for Religions for Peace USA, program coordinator for the Jewish Orthodox Feminist Alliance, assistant director of interreligious affairs for the American Jewish Committee, and secretariat for the International Jewish Committee on Interreligious Consultations, the formal Jewish representative in international interreligious dialogue. Okay, so the central question we're addressing here can be expressed in simple terms, although it's not a simple issue at all. Could the Catholic Church have done more leading up to and during the Holocaust? Did church leaders at the very highest level abdicate their own principles and their responsibility to confront and resist the untold suffering and death of millions of people? Might some Catholic leaders even have supported the Nazis and been indifferent to the plight of Jewish victims? Or did Catholic leaders at the Vatican work behind the scenes to save thousands of Jews, both locally and across Europe, while trying not to bring undue attention upon the church from the Nazis? Was Pius's silence necessary to keep the church safe and prevent the Nazis from bombing Vatican City? As the film Holy Silence documents clearly, Pope Pius XII, who headed the church from 1939 until 1958, insisted upon a stance of total neutrality during World War II, refusing to publicly criticize Hitler's anti-Semitic policies well after the mass killing of Jewish men, women, and children was well known. The holy silence, that is, was his, and it reverberated widely within the church. Some 80 years later, many now seek a reckoning. Just over a year ago, in March 2020, the Vatican opened its archives covering the papacy of Pius XII. Now, just to be clear, thousands of Vatican documents from the war era had already been released in recent decades, as the Vatican fought rumors that Pius had collaborated with the Nazis and the fascists. But many more were sealed until last year, when the full archive was made available to researchers. Writing of the importance of this release, Professor Kurtzer noted, Holocaust denial might be dismissed as the delirium of a crackpot fringe, but denial of responsibility for the war and for the Holocaust remains widespread in Europe and in the Christian churches. A few months after the unsealing, Professor Kurtzer reported on these newly available documents in a stunning article in The Atlantic, which was published last August. These documents, which are millions of pages that will take years to fully comb through, promise to tell us more about the Pope's silence, his refusal not to protest even after the Germans rounded up and deported Rome's Jews in 1943. Taking them to Auschwitz, where most of them died. The newly available documents, Kurtzer tells us, illuminate private conversations, the internal wranglings of Vatican leaders over whether the Pope should protest these deaths or not. Monsignor Angelo Dell'Acqua prevailed, arguing that it was quite opportune to be wary of the Jews' influence. Government laws should be used to restrict the rights of Jews. This was necessary to protect Christians from alleged Jewish crimes. As Dell'Acqua wrote, there was no lack in the history of Rome of measures adopted by the pontiff to limit the influence of the Jews, end quote. The Pope remained silent. Some years later, when the chief rabbi of Palestine, Isaac Herzog, begged the Pope to help get the missing Jewish children orphaned by the Holocaust, many of them now baptized Catholic, returned to Jewish guardians by issuing a public call for their release, Dell'Acqua advised the Pope not to make any such statement, nor really do anything at all. And Pius apparently took his advice. Few Catholic thinkers have worked as hard to address the challenge of these painful events to the church and the challenges of historical anti-Semitism to Catholics more broadly, as well as the silence that enables all racisms, than Professor Pawlikowski. And I am profoundly grateful to you, Father, for your honest engagement with issues and realities that I know bring sorrow to Catholics. And Professor Kurtzer, I am profoundly grateful to you for your own crucial work that makes it impossible for us to avoid or deny these hard truths. All of us undergo reckonings of different kinds, great and small, and they are hard. However beloved Pius XII may be to many Catholics still, this is a reckoning that must be had at every level of the church. And now let me turn things over to Maharat Pikernes for this discussion.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Griffith, and thank you to all of you for joining us. I'm really so delighted to host two such prominent scholars on this issue and to be part of this conversation. So let me say we're going to try to keep this as a conversation as much as possible. I do know that there's numerous of you who are watching. I will be looking at the chat and at the Q&A and trying to incorporate questions as we go. But let me start off with this really big question for the two of you, and either one of you is welcome to start. But so Dr. Griffith really framed the issue for us in terms of the history, but I want to really push us in terms of saying, what's at stake in this conversation? Why are we talking about somebody who died over 60 years ago, something that happened over 70 years ago? What's at stake for us in talking about this?
Well, let me begin, since the question was put as what is at stake, particularly for the Catholic Church. I think, put in a single word, I would say integrity. Integrity based on authentic transparency. I think we need to try to delineate what Pius XII did, and more perhaps what he didn't do, through research in the archives, which, as was already indicated, will be a monumental effort that may take as much as a decade. Let me just comment, there actually is not a single archive. What we're talking about right now in terms of the release of documents cover about 5 or 6 archives. It becomes more complex because access to the archives require access to and permission to look at each of the archives. There is no overarching permission to look at all of them. So it becomes a very complex process to even get access to them. And it's been made more complicated by the COVID crisis, which has closed the Vatican archives for several times in recent months. But for me, especially coming to the discussion from the standpoint of someone specializing in social ethics, I have to ask the question, what is the implications of the way Pius XII handled one of the most fundamental moral crises facing the Catholic Church? And I think the problem that we already know is a reality in the way that he did handle it, is the fact that he was very much of a pope dedicated to the idea that, in fact, his job was to protect the self-interest of the church and its operations as his primary responsibility. Protecting the human rights or the lives of other people, especially those who were not Catholic, was not a high priority for anyone, with some exceptions, but for most people in the Catholic Church of his time. The movement of those kinds of issues to the center of Catholic responsibility is something that primarily occurred in and through the Vatican Council and the subsequent writings and discussions on that. And that continues today. But Pius XII, I think, saw his role as in a very diplomatic way. I think it's terribly important to remember that he inherited diplomacy in his mother's milk, if I can put it that way. His father was a very committed Italian diplomat that loved the idea of the old papal states. I think most Catholics are just not aware that the Catholic Church was not just a religious institution, it was a very real political institution during the period of the Papal States, which of course collapsed in the face of revolutionary Europe. But his father was very, very upset about the demise of the Papal States, and really experienced some new joy when in 1929, the Vatican mini-state was reestablished. But Pius XII grew up in the atmosphere of diplomacy. He was targeted for the Vatican diplomatic corps even before his ordination, and he really imbued that sense of what it meant to be Pope. It meant to be the chief diplomat of the church. This doesn't mean that he didn't do some things, but I don't think that saving Jews or even saving Poles during the Holocaust, who also sought his assistance and were very angry that he, by and large, did not offer such assistance. This was not, from his point of view, his main responsibility. And I think what we really need to ask in today's church is, what do we do in times of grave social crisis? What is the role of religious leadership in such times? And you know, there was a very interesting counter example that took place in the small African country of Malawi about a decade or so after probably more than that, but within the first 2 decades after the actual Nazi Holocaust had ended. And there the president, Dr. Hastings Banda, tried to literally exterminate people who practiced indigenous religion. And the Catholic bishops of the country, most of them foreigners, to a person stood up and said, "You cannot do this. This is wrong. You must stop the killing." And he said to them, I will destroy your churches and I will kill your catechists, which certainly would bring down the structural stability of the Catholic Church. But they said, go ahead. I think this was a counterexample to the cautious diplomatic approach to the whole Nazi era that I think motivated Pius XII, and is something that I think we have to seriously question in today's Catholic Church.
Thank you.
Yeah, well, you've hit on many points that we could discuss, and maybe we'll get a chance to discuss some of them. Let me just, I'll go back to this larger question of what's at stake. And I see it in terms of what accounted for the Holocaust. I mean, this is part of what's at stake. How could it have been possible in the middle of this? I think I said in the film, in the middle of the 20th century, at what had been regarded as one of the most advanced civilizations in world history, and certainly European history, that tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people could have felt that murdering Jewish children and old people and women and so on was a good thing to be doing. And so from my point of view, there's a bit of on the one hand, Pius XII is a crucial figure, but it is even beyond the personality of Pius XII and his strong points and his limitations. John Paul II, because of the controversy over the silence of the Pope, called on a Vatican commission to look into this question of whether the Church bore any responsibility for the demonization of the Jews that could have led to the Holocaust. And after practically a dozen years, this commission produced its report in 1998 called We Remember. People can look it up online if they're interested. And what it basically said was that unfortunately it's true there had been negative religious ideas about Jews for many centuries in the church, and not just the Catholic Church, but the Christian churches in general. But this had nothing to do with the kind of demonization of the Jews that led to the Holocaust. That was something more modern, was racial in nature and so on. And this is just not real history as a historian. It's a kind of wishful history. So the question, from my point of view, is not just about this silence of Pius XII during the Holocaust, but how the Holocaust could have taken place. And one of the reasons I think that's not recognized, and I have been working in these newly opened Vatican archives, one of the reasons that hasn't been recognized for the Pope's silence is he was afraid that, it wasn't that he was afraid only that the Nazis might take action against the institutional church if he were to be critical of them. He was afraid of Catholics in Germany, that many of them were Nazis, were loyal Nazis, and that he could produce a schism in the church. And there had been something of a schism in the Protestant churches in Germany along these lines. So there are some very crucial questions here that, and put it even in a larger perspective as someone who works in Italian history, it's not just that the church, the Catholic Church has had a hard time coming to terms with this history. It's Italy, for example, as well. The fact that Italy was part of the Axis powers and the ally of Hitler is not an impression you generally get when you talk to Italians who will talk about the resistance. We just celebrated kind of resistance anniversary, April 25th. And the fact that the Italians were in fact allied to the Nazis and would have, there would have been Mussolini would still have been in power much longer if they had actually won the war, as most people, including the Pope, thought they would, which is the other aspect in trying to understand why Pius XII remained silent and wouldn't criticize Mussolini or Hitler. He thought they were going to win the war, as did many people, for good reason, given how rapidly the German army advanced first through Poland and then through Netherlands, Belgium, and France, and drove the British famously at Dunkirk off the continent. So this is all part of a much larger coming to terms with history.
So building off of that, I was saying just before some people came on, if you were here for sort of like the chit chat beforehand, I was saying that I remember when I first started working in Catholic Jewish relations, which was really, I think, some of my first foray into interfaith work. It seemed like this was the big topic of conversation. It was about the archives of Pope Pius XII and the canonization of Pope Pius XII. But to be really honest, when I first started talking about doing this program and bringing the two of you together, there were some people who pushed back at me and said, we shouldn't be doing this, and that this might really be upsetting to Catholic Jewish relations, that this would be offensive to our Catholic partners to raise this question. And so I'm curious, Father Polakowski, if you can comment on, as somebody who's done Catholic Jewish relations and deeply embedded in this work, for the people who feel like we shouldn't be talking about this because we've come so far, this would be damaging to look back. What is your response to that?
I think we have to be completely open in terms of the discussion about the historic relationship between Jews and Christians over the centuries. The late Father Edward Flannery, who kind of opened the discussion with his book, The Anguish of the Jews, around the time of the Second Vatican Council, always remarked that the pages of history that Jews knew the best in terms of the relationship with Christians and Christian states is the history that is least known among many Catholics. We have to admit in Catholicism the dark side of the history of the church. I would say the dark side of religion as such. Religion, contrary to what some people would proclaim, has not always been on the side of justice, goodness, etc. It has a checkered history, and that also holds true for the Catholic Church as well as Protestant churches. And it seems to me the Nazi era represents one of the most challenging periods of testing the true meaning of true meaning of the church in terms of its relationship to Jews, but to other groups in the world as well, and the failures therein. Let me just make a couple comments on what Dr. Kurtzer just said. Just a slight correction. Actually, we remember the 1998 document on the Shoah was largely written by the Holy See's Commission for Religious Relations with Jews, headed at the time by Cardinal Edward Idris Cassidy of Australia, who just died literally a few weeks ago. And it did take into account the commission's work that Dr. Kurtzer referred to. That commission basically examined the 12 or so volumes of archival material that were released under Pope Paul VI. But the commission itself did not write, we remember, but he's absolutely correct. And it's very problematical. That document had certain benefits. It put Holocaust education, for example, on the Catholic table, but it also distorted significantly. And there was no one more aware of that than the late Cardinal Cassidy, who was a very close friend of mine. Cardinal Cassidy was forced to accept, as a condition of releasing the document, forced to accept distortions in the history of the time imposed on him by the Congregation for Sacred Doctrine in the Vatican, which has to rule on every single document that comes from the Vatican. And they put it quite bluntly to him: either you accept the changes that we are proposing, or the document will not be approved for formal release. And he made a very, very hard choice to go ahead and release the document while he was quite well aware of its significant limitations. And one of the limitations, maybe the most serious limitation, was the claim that it was somehow only wayward Christians who had supported the Nazis. That is simply nonsense, as I think Dr. Kurtzer has rightly said. The people who supported, from the Catholic Church, who supported the Nazi movement, or at least were indifferent to its violent attack on the Jews and other victims, did so because of a long, long tradition of anti-Judaism that really merged into anti-Semitism throughout Christian history. And the attitude of the influential person who advised Pius XII on some of the decisions, only his outlook only represents the kind of prevailing outlook that was present in so much of Catholicism before Vatican II. The other distortion historically, which Cardinal Cassidy had to accept, was the claim that most Christians Catholic Christians tried to save Jews, and only a minority collaborated. That simply is a total factual inaccuracy. So I think it's very, very critical that we put the historical record straight, and we really deal with its implications as it actually occurred, not as a fictitious history, in order to sort out certain questions we face presently in the church about responding to moral crises.
I think
So let me.
it's notable that the German bishops recently came out with a statement accepting responsibility and expressing regret for their support of the war, of the Nazi war effort. And the French bishops came out with a statement expressing regret for some of their role in supporting the Pétain regime that was involved in exporting the Jews to their death in Nazi death camps. So that's, one thing I think we need to recognize, and we see it, of course, that's really embodied in Father Pawlikowski, that often you talk about the church or the Vatican. In fact, it's a very heterogeneous organization with over 1 billion people. And so it's not one thing I think that's important, as we're seeing, I think, in our discussion, that it's not a matter of the Jews versus the Catholics. This is something that has divided Catholic opinion, and including it at the highest levels, as we're seeing. The question of some folks thinks it's better now we don't talk about this because somehow it's going to make for more controversy. I'm reminded that when my book came out on the role of the Vatican in the rise of modern anti-Semitism, which is called The Popes Against the Jews, maybe a little too provocatively, we were going to have the big event launching the book in New York was going to take place at the Hillel Center of NYU with a very prominent cast of characters from all religious traditions and so forth. And a week before that event, I got a call from from Knopf telling me, the publisher, that it was canceled. It was canceled because it was, in this case, the Hillel director and rabbi decided no, they were getting too many calls of people upset about us bringing up this topic. They really didn't want to do it. So we had to move the event a block or two to a center at NYU. So one hears also, and this, by the way, has to do, often you hear the argument about Israel here. That is, look, we need the support of the Catholic Church for Israel. That should be our priority. This is all ancient history. Let's not bring that up. And let's be grateful to the church for being supportive today in our organizational Jewish priorities are. So unfortunately, these kinds of repression of the history, rather than trying to understand it, is we find not just Catholics, but also Jews.
Let me just add one point, that I think we have to pursue this history not only on, up to the end of Nazism, but I think we also have to look at Pius XII's record in the immediate post-Nazi era, because he no longer had to fear the supposed problems that some would say kept him from responding, such as the bombing of Italy and the Vatican and so on. That was no longer a reality, a real possibility, and he could have made some decisions to really try to bring particularly German Catholics into a conversation about their failure and responsibility. And he did almost the contrary. David, you may know at least the name of Gordon Zahn. Gordon Zahn wrote the first book on German Catholics and Hitler's wars. He happened to have been a professor of mine at the undergraduate level at Loyola University here in Chicago. And he worked very closely with a historian named Edward Gargan, who eventually went on to the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And Gargan was passionate as a Catholic historian about the failure of Pius XII in the Vatican. But the Vatican actually tried to get Professor Zahn fired from Loyola University for raising the question of Pius XII and the failure of the German churches. So even after World War II, there was not only silence about the possibility of collaboration, or at least avoidance of any protest. There was even a concrete effort to undercut people in the Catholic Church who were trying, like Professor Zahn, who were trying to begin that conversation about Catholic responsibility.
So we're getting a lot of questions coming in, which is very exciting, and I want to try to get to all of them. But before I get to some of the audience questions, I want to really kind of, Dr. Kurtzer, you you were one of the few people who was actually able to go to the archives before things were shut down. And I would love if you could, I know we've touched on the history in many ways. Both of you have expertise in this area, but I'm curious if you could share some of what you might have expected to find, and then some of what you actually found when you accessed the archives.
Yeah, so the archives opened, the timing wasn't good, as was referred to. They opened March 2nd, a year ago, 20. And I was there.
And Italy was not the greatest place to be at the start of COVID.
No, and so the epidemic had already begun, but things hadn't shut down. And they did open March 2nd. So I was there, 4:30 to as they opened the door to what used to be called the Vatican Secret Archives, and now it's called the Vatican Apostolic Archive. And spent that week there for the 45 hours, I guess, that they allowed me there, and in the Secretary of State Archive, which is just across the courtyard. As Father Polakowski mentioned, there are a number of different archives that are important. Also the Inquisition Archive, where I work. And fortunately, they then, that Friday, they announced they were closing it down till further notice. There was a lockdown in Italy. I more or less had to leave the country. Fortunately, they reopened in early June, and although they've occasionally had to pause briefly, it's largely been open under somewhat reduced hours since then. And fortunately, I have a collaborator who's Roman, who's Italian, a historian, and he's been there working these archives essentially every day. And we've been working together on publications and materials. So I have thousands of pages of archival documents from those newly open archives digitized on my computer that I'm working with. As Father Polakowski mentioned, there are tens of millions of documents in these archives, and it's not just the Vatican archives, of which there are a number, but the Jesuit archives just opened up. The Central Jesuit archives, which were about a block away from the Vatican, opened up just this January, so even more recently, and there are hundreds of thousands of interesting documents there as well for various reasons. So on the one hand, there's a huge amount to work through, and it will take many years till we've fully extracted all the important information from them. On the other hand, they are well organized, and over the last 10 years in preparing them for the opening, they've created a lot of finding aids which describe the documents in a fair amount of detail. So that, for example, if you like me are interested in the Pope Pius XII's relationship with Mussolini during the war, you can go to the archives of the papal nuncio to Italy and to certain other archive, which has these finding aids, which allow you to relatively efficiently look at material. That said, they also, however, limit how many folders of material you can see each day, namely at the main archive, just 5. And they make copying it very expensive. And it's practically $10 for the first page from every folder from which you want to copy material. So there's incredible richness there, and we're finding very interesting things, not least the fact Father Polakowski mentioned that in response to pressures about the silence of the Pope during the Holocaust, the Vatican had commissioned a series for Jesuit scholars to put together what turned out to be 12 large volumes, each one having hundreds of documents in it, dealing with this history. One thing I have discovered is that although they publish much important material, they also systematically left out certain materials that were compromising basically to the Vatican narrative. And I'm working on a book right now on this, which hopefully will be out next year. That will be.
Sorry to interrupt. Can you say explicitly what is the Vatican narrative, and then what is compromising?
Well, the Vatican narrative is that first of all, that there was no anti-Semitism motivating anyone in the Vatican or people around the Pope. They were all doing absolutely everything they possibly could to save the maximum number of Jewish lives possible, and that if they didn't speak out more forcefully at all, it was only because of fear that it would cost more Jewish lives if they spoke out. That's a narrative. I've discovered too that the Pope engaged in secret negotiations with Hitler beginning within 2 or 3 months of becoming Pope. That's never been known. That's all word of that is been excluded from those 12 volumes. So yeah, there's much I think we are learning, despite the fact there were those who said that given the publication of those hundreds of documents, we already largely knew, what had happened, and there'd be nothing much to be learned. I think we're learning that there's a lot to be learned.
So I'm trying to weed through some of the questions. We have so many coming in, but some of the people are asking about the encyclical that was drafted by Pope Pius XI, which was such a for Pope Pius XI, I think such a climactic moment in the film Holy Silence. People are asking, is there any copy of it, or any way to see what it actually said?
Oh yeah, I mean the texts are available. There have been any number of books written on it, and it was composed by two Jesuits working independently. One was the American Jesuit who was very much involved in the early struggle against racism in this country, Father John Lafarge. The other person was a noted European Catholic scholar of kind of the social tradition of Catholicism. The part condemning anti-Semitism and racism would have been, I think, a very significant contribution. There are those who would say, however, that if the other part of it, which really still described the Catholic-Jewish relationship in traditional anti-Judaic terms, that would have been somewhat of a disaster if it had received approbation from anyone in the Vatican, and may well have blocked the ability to totally restate the Catholic-Jewish relationship by Vatican II in the document Nostra Aetate, chapter 4. So, there's mixed feelings about whether or not the proclamations that were in that so-called secret document would have helped or hurt the situation overall. Certainly, there's no question if they had released and with approval Father Lafarge's section, I think it would have helped somewhat. How much, hard to judge, but it would have helped somewhat, I think. But the second part of it might well have been a long-term negative. So
I think one of the important thing to point out there, supplementing what Father Polakowski was saying, is that the Pope Pius XI called, this was kind of a shock to this American Jesuit, John Lafarge, who happened to be in Rome, and he got this summons from the Pope that he wanted to talk to him. So of course he was surprised, couldn't imagine what it would be, and was even more surprised when the Pope asked him to write to draft an encyclical denouncing racism and anti-Semitism. Normally encyclicals are written by experts around the Vatican and not some American who happened to be in Rome. And the reason was, I think that in my book, The Pope of Mussolini, I talk about this, the Pope didn't really trust the usual cast of characters who wrote these encyclicals, the people around the Vatican, and went way out of normal channels to call on this Jesuit. But John Lafarge felt, because of Jesuit discipline, that he needed to inform the superior of the order, the worldwide superior, who was a Polish a man named Ledachowski, who had long been head of the Jesuit order and who was, from my point of view, a vicious anti-Semite. And Ledachowski was basically outraged that the Pope had this idea of an encyclical denouncing anti-Semitism, and basically forced on Lafarge, this German theologian, the Father Polakowski mentioned, Gunlock, who had written all sorts of, you might say, traditional Christian anti-Jewish kinds of writings in the past. And so that may well explain the kind of hodgepodge that resulted, that Father Pawlikowski described well.
So we have some follow-up questions, you've already raised the question of it's an impossibility to know an alternative history, right? So even with the claim, right? So if the Pope had spoken out more forcefully, would the Nazis have attacked the Vatican? Would that have harmed the Catholic community? There's no way to know that because that's obviously not what happened. But there are questions in terms of once the Nazis lost the war, why didn't the Pope do more in terms of the follow-up? And particularly some of the questions about reuniting Jewish children with their parents, especially those Jewish children who were hiding in Christian homes or in monasteries in Catholic institutions. And I will just say, I mean, obviously that's a story that predates the Nazi regime. I first kind of got to know you as Dr. Kurtzer through the kidnapping of Edgardo Mortara, which I read in college, and that story. And so this is not a story that's exclusive for World War II. But I know from your article in The Atlantic, that was part of what you discovered in the archives were efforts to hinder reuniting children with their parents. And I wonder if you could speak more about that.
Yes, and then maybe later we can turn to the question of whether it would have made any difference for the Pope to speak out, or what he could have said that would have made any difference. But in terms of the post-war period and this issue of the Holocaust surviving children, my Atlantic piece focused on probably the best known case, which was these two Jewish brothers, the Finley brothers in France. But in some ways they were typical in that their parents were arrested and sent to their death in concentration camp in Germany, left behind these two little children who were like 1 and 3 years old at the time. They ended up being cared for by Catholic women and in Catholic institutions. And then at the end of the war, the siblings of the parents who had survived came to bring them back. So it wasn't just Jews in general, it was actually their aunts and uncles who wanted to bring them back into their families. And the group of people who were keeping them, including a number of nuns, religious women nuns and monks, ended up hiding them because the French courts were ruling that they needed to be returned to their family. And so this, we don't know how many cases of this existed. There were many children who became orphaned by Jewish children who became orphaned by the Holocaust in places like Poland, of course, which had the largest, had 3 million Jews before the war, and other parts of Europe. There were likely thousands who survived the war while their parents went off to their deaths, and survived the war protected by either Catholic families, if we're now just talking about the Catholic part of this, or Catholic institutions. Now, many of them were baptized, and we just don't know how many never made their way back to the parents. One thing that we have discovered as a result of the newly opened archives, and that was the subject of my Atlantic article that you mentioned earlier last August, was that the Pope and the Vatican and the Inquisition Office, or the Holy Office, was asked to weigh in by the prelates involved in this in France. And their advice was hold out as long as possible. If it becomes impossible, because actually quite a few monks and nuns were being arrested, at a certain point you have to give in, do so, but do what you can to avoid that, because, and here we get back to this same kind of theological issue that involved the Mortara case back in the 19th century, the notion that children who had been baptized now should be regarded as Catholic, and it would be a sin for them to be returned to a Jewish family, because then they would be guilty of apostasy.
Let me just add a word about the question of why Pius XII didn't do or say more after the war had ended. I think and I'm not defending him at all on this, but if you want to understand it fully, I think you have to understand the politics of immediate post-war Germany. The Catholic community had felt itself to be second class in Germany after the Culture Kampf, and was looking for ways to kind of restore its equality with the Protestant Church since the Culture Kampf. And some, regrettably, both during the Nazi era, but especially in that immediate post-war era when you had the first Catholic chancellor of Germany, they did not want to write or do anything that they felt would undermine the integrity of the Catholics who had come into power in Germany in terms of political leadership. And as I say, while I don't defend that, I think if you want to understand it, you do have to understand the situation somewhat in the context of immediate post-war politics in Germany. And the fact too that, and I'm sure David, you know this quite well, there was a tradition of Catholic history and Protestant history, and the twain never met. They each had their versions of the religious history of Germany over the centuries. And strangely, this did not even disappear after the, not least not immediately, after the end of the Hitler regime. So there's a lot of complexity within the German political and historical scene that did affect how the period of the Holocaust was described by historians in the immediate years following World War II.
There's two different ways I can follow up on that, and I'm trying to keep it all together because there's so much here. And but let me start by first of all asking, we're getting a number of questions, Father Polakowski, in terms of we're framing this in terms of the lessons learned. And so the question of looking back at this history and recognizing well, I guess I shouldn't assume whether or not there is a recognition of some of the mistakes, whether or not there are lessons learned from that. Has that changed the way that the Catholic Church has responded in other moral crises? And some of the questions that have come up specifically relate to the rise of white supremacy in the United States or the persecution of LGBTQ individuals within Poland. But I'm sure there's lots of other examples across the world. Is the Catholic Church responding differently in these situations?
Well, in some cases, yes. I mean, there have been leading bishops and cardinals who supported efforts at social justice in many parts of the world and spoke out against the oppression and deprivation of people in terms of human rights. Human rights really does not become a solid central concept in Catholic social teaching until after the Nazi era. I did mention the example, might be a small isolated example, but the example of the bishops of Malawi when they faced the attacks from the President Hastings Banda and so on. And while they never made reference that I know of to the experience of the Holocaust, it does represent a counter witness. And there were people who did stand up, even of some bishops who did stand up against Nazism, but they were hardly the majority. Most were either supportive or were at least silent and so on. I think that I don't think that at this point yet, even in the current milieu of Catholic social ethics, the Holocaust is seen at the Holocaust era is seen as an absolutely critical period for examination of Catholic responsibility. Usually, if we do a history of Catholic social teaching, we jump from the two social encyclicals that were issued prior to Vatican II to the period of the Second Vatican Council. And even a good friend of mine and an outstanding Catholic ethicist, Father Charles Curran, if you look at his writings on Catholic social teaching, he gives a few footnotes to the Nazi era, but that is it. There is no solid examination of that period in terms of what we can learn on Catholic social teaching. I think contemporary Catholicism at various levels has been at best moderately adequate on the issue of racism. The most recent statement from the American bishops is seen as rather disappointing, to put it mildly, especially by many in the African American Catholic Church. I would have to say that the general position of the Catholic leadership, including the Vatican, on LGBTQ issues is dismal from my point of view. And even Pope Francis, who on some occasions has given more positive signals in terms of acceptance, has also at other times repeated the classical, I'll call it attack on LGBTQ people that has been central to Catholicism, and not only Catholicism, but speaking as a Catholic. So I don't think, and you know, we need to remember that gay people, mostly gay men, not very many lesbians, but mostly gay men, and mostly German gay men, some from a few other parts, such as Poland, but were attacked as part of the Nazi ideology of basic human degradation. Although the gay victims of the Nazis were seen as people who had the possibility of rehabilitation, whereas Jews had no possibility of rehabilitation. Even being baptized was not something that could save them for most of the Nazi leaders. They were still inherently a negative force on humanity.
We're getting a number of questions about Nazis who escaped Germany during the war, and whether there's any evidence or any implication that the Vatican helped with that in any way.
Yes, although there's actually a pretty good book called Nazis on the Run by a scholar who's looked into this issue. And it's a complicated history. There was the Austrian bishop who's in charge of kind of the German church in Rome, name is Hudal, I think quite clearly helped a number of Nazi war criminals escape Europe. And others were involved in the so-called rat line as well. One of the complications is they're not the only one, that is the Catholic Church certainly, or the Vatican, not the only institution involved in helping Nazi war criminals escape. It seems that American CIA and others were presumably in the context of the war on communism being more important than fighting against the Nazis. And it still remains, I haven't seen any documents that I've come across in these newly open archives that get at any direct responsibility of the Pope, which sometimes comes up. So that said, one thing I do see is that for the Vatican, there were the good Nazis and the bad Nazis, just like there were the good Italian fascists and the bad fascists. And the difference from the Vatican point of view, if I can generalize a little bit, is the good fascists and the good Nazis wanted to support the institutional church, and the bad Nazis, the bad fascists, were anti-clerics and anti-church and trying to reduce the influence of the church. So you had, for example, Ernst von Weizsäcker, who had been the #2 to Ribbentrop at the Secretary of Foreign Ministry during the first several years of the war. The Nazi Foreign Ministry became the ambassador to the Vatican in the summer of 1943. And following the war, he was one of the people at Nuremberg on trial for crimes against humanity. And the Vatican did everything it could to argue that he was not one of the bad Nazis, he was a good Nazi. So this was another kind of distinction that I think is a bit behind the question of what Vatican or the Church did in individual cases.
I would just add to that. There is some indication that something called the Croatian College in Rome. There are many countries that have a strong Catholic identity, established places essentially for education of priests in Rome, and the Croatian College was one such entity. And I think there's little question that they had some role in aiding and abetting the so-called rat line. However, there have been some people who have written on this who have kind of said, well, it was a pontifical college, and therefore the Pope probably knew about what was going on there. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of institutions that have the title pontifical added to their name. Many of them are in Rome. I can assure you that the Pope has no idea what goes on day to day in those places. Now, there was a few years ago, and I don't know, David, if you've ever seen these documents, some documents discovered in the Argentine Consulate in Rome, which seemed to establish a greater level of knowledge among key Vatican officials regarding this rat line. But, that's also an indication that some of the, perhaps some of the more important documents on this may not in fact be in the Vatican archives. They may be in state archives somewhere. For example, one of the late John Morley, whom I'm sure David, on his book on Vatican diplomacy, always argued that one thing Pius XII could have done is to really instruct his papal nuncios to make saving Jews a priority. Several of them did, including the future John the 23rd, but it would be very interesting to know more about any interchanges on that question between these nuncios and the Vatican. Now, I realize communication was not easy, but it wasn't totally absent. And I suspect there was some give and take, and maybe in terms of letters and cables from these nuncios to the Vatican regarding this issue of trying to save Jews through false baptismal certificates and so on.
Well, just one point there, probably the most important nuncio from this point of view is the papal nuncio to Germany, Cesare Orsenigo, and he was constantly trying to make Hitler look better than he was. I mean, and he was really one of the more saddest cases, I think, in this whole history. He had been appointed strangely by Pius XI, despite the fact he didn't have much in the way of any knowledge of the greater world. And the Berlin became kind of enamored by his proximity to Hitler and so forth. And so I have been reading his hundreds of his reports to the Vatican, and which the Pope got to read. And they're remarkable given what was going on, for still trying to argue that, well, on the one hand, he couldn't really have any influence over these matters because Hitler said it was none of the church, the Vatican's business, it was a domestic affair. But secondly, that things got exaggerated, and actually there were a lot of yes, there were some bad Nazis, but a lot of them were basically good Christians. And so the Pope shouldn't worry too much about the neo-pagan aspects of the Nazi regime.
You know, I just mentioned in terms of the post Holocaust situation in Pius XII, one of the strongest critics of Pius XII was the noted Catholic philosopher Jacques Maritain, who resigned as the French ambassador to the Vatican in protest over Pius XII's refusal to really challenge German Catholics in the years right after World War II.
So this is going to take us into a slightly different direction, but I have to confess my own curiosity in this. In the film, the film created a lot of drama around this moment just before Pope Pius XI was convening the convocation of the bishops and the cardinals and this encyclical, and then of course died just before. And people want to know if there are conspiracy theories around that. Is there a kind of an investigation? Is there any talk? And did the film over dramatize that?
Well, you know, when I began working on my book on Pope Pius XI and Mussolini, the Pope and Mussolini, I was talking to someone in Italy and mentioned I was going to be writing this book on Pius XI, and she said, "Oh, the one who was killed by Mussolini." So Italians actually are quite find the conspiracy theories quite convincing in many cases.
But Mussolini wouldn't have killed him because he was going to speak out about anti-Semitism. That would have been a different reason.
No, well, that was part of it. So there are two different things. The encyclical is one thing, but actually what you're referring to is there was going to be this huge occasion on the 10th anniversary of the Lateran Pacts, which is what established Vatican City, which is what ended separation of church and state in Italy and established the Catholic Church as the basically official state religion and gave it various benefits. This was all negotiated between Mussolini and the Vatican, Vatican Secretary of State at the time. So this was going to be the 10th anniversary. And Mussolini had long been hailing this as, you know, one of his great accomplishments, bringing peace with the church. And I know from reading the reports of Mussolini's ambassador to the Holy See, as well as from his spies in the Vatican, because he had quite a few spies in the Vatican, you can read their reports. They were all telling him that on that anniversary occasion, where all 350 or so bishops of Italy were going to be there, along with the world press, the Pope was going to denounce Mussolini for embracing Hitler and his anti-Semitism and his racism. So Mussolini, we know, was very worried about this. And the fact that the Pope dies one day before he's supposed to give the speech led to all this conspiracy theory, which was furthered by the fact that the Pope's own doctor at the time was sick in bed that week. And the number 2 man, if we can call him that, in the Vatican physician service was the father of Mussolini's lover, Claudio Petacci, Dr. Petacci. And so, you know, you can easily see the scenario. However, I probably would have sold a lot more copies of my book if I had found evidence that this actually took place, but I didn't.
So, Father John, this is not a conversation within the church at all. Any conspiracy theories around the death of Pius XI?
Well, it's certainly not. I haven't heard any outside of Italy. I think Professor Kurtzer is correct that within Italy there probably are some, and within the Italian Church. I don't think that there's. I mean, you'd have to go back. I'm not a scholar on Pius XI. You'd have to go back and look at some of the major Catholic publications, such as America and Commonweal and others, and what they may have said about the death of Pius XI and whether they associated any sinister forces in terms of bringing about his death at this very crucial time. But that's not in my wheelhouse in terms of.
Fair enough. Well, so, before we're kind of coming to an end, one of the questions that's come up a couple of times, so I'll pose it. I don't know if this also goes out of both of your wheelhouse, but you referenced earlier, Father Polakowski, I think you specifically said that there's Protestant history is its own history as well. And so a few people have asked about the role of the Protestant Church, specifically the Lutheran Church, whether they were complicit, and was Dietrich Bonhoeffer an exception to the rule or a model within that?
Well, I think, as Professor Kurtzer has already indicated, the Protestant Church was very split on the question of Hitler. There was an element of the church which strongly supported and identified the so-called German Christian movement, the Deutsche Christian movement, which really embraced Hitler as kind of God's best man for Germany at the time. There was also, and you didn't have a whole lot of that kind of public embrace, especially organized public embrace within the Catholic Church at the time. There were some who did embrace Nazism. My colleague, Professor Father Kevin Spicer of Stonehill College and formerly of Notre Dame, has written extensively on the so-called brown priests who did collaborate in one way or another directly with the Nazi leadership. Now, I think the Nazis didn't particularly relish Christian involvement. One of the expressions of frustration on the part of some of the brown priests was that they couldn't move up the hierarchy in the Nazi system. Their support was accepted, but it did not lead to, no matter what they did, it did not lead to any kind of promotion within the Nazi bureaucracy. So yes, Dietrich Bonhoeffer was an exception, even though certainly early on in his theological career, he did express some very classical ideas about the Jewish-Christian relationship, which certainly were not positive in terms of the outlook on Jews and Judaism. But he clearly became a staunch opponent of Hitler, got jailed, died a short time died in a Nazi prison a short time prior to the end of the war, and so on. So I know a little bit, something of that, because I was a collaborator to an extent with one of his relatives, Eberhard Bethke, who knew Professor Eberhard Bethke, who was part of the family and knew some of the things that happened in that inner circle. So yeah, Bonhoeffer clearly, and he decided, you may remember, Bonhoeffer came to the United States to study, and as the Nazi era was beginning, and then he had to face the challenge, does he go back? And he decided to go back and try to establish a kind of new version, not totally, I think what he would maybe better say, a purified version of Christianity. He had a kind of underground seminary going and so on, and he really tried to develop a church that would be free of the kind of political machinations that he saw in the Protestant Church. Another person who did stand up to an extent was the famous Protestant theologian Karl Barth, but he was rather in a safe place outside of Germany. And he had some influence definitely on the Deutsche Christian movement. And, you know, they did issue a proclamation condemning Nazism. There was also a proclamation that in words was not all that different by the German Bishops' Conference in Fulda, that met in Fulda. However, once the Concordat was signed, the formal agreement between the Vatican or the Holy See and the Nazi regime, that Fulda document went into the deep freeze and was not really referenced during the rest of the Nazi era.
Well, let me just say I'm mindful of the time. I know we've already gone a couple of minutes over, and so I'm actually going to invite each of you to give a final word. But let me, before I do that, I'm actually just going to say a profound thank you to both of you for sharing of your wisdom, of your expertise, this openness, this vulnerability, of really grappling with this incredibly painful time in history and really modeling a way that we can do that in dialogue with one another. I want to thank our partners in this, hosted by the Danforth Center for Religion and Politics at Washington University, the Barnardin Center at Catholic Theological Union, and the Newmark Institute for Human Relations at the Jewish Community Relations Council. And you know, I'm going to let both of you get the final word because this is what both of you have committed your time to. I think, you know, just kind of with all of this, any final reflections or anything that you want to say in terms of closing us out, again, with the recognition we've already gone over.
Go ahead.
Oh, I would just say something similar to what Archbishop Gallagher, currently in the Vatican, the #2 man in the Secretary of State, said when the Vatican archives were opened. He said, "Let's keep an open mind and see what it comes out of this study. By all means, we should study it. And once we have a clear idea of what the picture was, we need to be able to mount a response." And that is certainly my approach to this current situation.
And I would just add my thanks to you for organizing this, and to Father Polakowski. It's been, I think, as you know, we've heard and seen, these are just very important issues with all sorts of implications today in terms of the use of religion to demonize minorities, whatever that religion may be. Aside from the specific issue of the understanding the attempt to exterminate Europe's Jews. And those of us who've been working in this area are often subject to various kinds of vilification, as anybody can go online and see, and various ad hominem attacks. So it is refreshing to have these occasions, to have these kind of serious discussions. And given the fact that we've just gotten such a huge amount of new material to look through over the next 2, 3, 4 years, these discussions will only be further enriched.
Well, thank you again. Thank you to everyone who joined us. And I should say that when I first reached out to you, Professor Kurtzer, about coming, I think you agreed to do this talk on condition that we get you to actually come to St. Louis when we're able to travel again, when your next book comes out. And so we look forward to hosting that, and Father Polakowski to bringing you from Chicago, I hope as well, in a time where it'd be wonderful to all be in a room together. But for now, I'm grateful we were able to have this virtual space. I know we had people joining us from all across the country, not just from where I am in St. Louis, not to mention that both of you are all over. And so thank you all for taking some time out of your night and for participating. Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Bye.